We're moving on to our next session. There's hardly a moment for breath, but I'm very conscious that our next kind chair is in New Zealand, and she's somewhat, at least a couple of hours ahead of us. And I'm sure there's also competition for her attention from her little daughter. So we're very fortunate that we've got Fleur Te Aho with us. So it's a great pleasure. People will think that Louise and I have just set up this conference so we can see all our friends and beloved former students, but it's a great pleasure to have Fleur here chairing this panel. Fleur teaches at the University of Auckland. She's a Maori woman. She teaches Indigenous peoples in the law and criminal law, and she has done some marvellous work particularly on the way at the international level, the way that the international legal system regulates or shapes, influences the norms relating to Indigenous peoples. And she's written about that in very, very lucid ways. So Fleur, it's wonderful to have you here. Thank you so much for joining us. And I will simply hand over this panel to your very capable hands. So welcome and thank you.
Kia ora, thank you. I ngā mana e ngā reo o rau rangatira mā, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Ko Fleur Te Aho tōku ingoa, he uri ahau o Ngāti Mutinga. So very warm greetings everyone, to Auntie and to Hilary for that kind introduction, the organisers, all the speakers and participants. My name is Fleur Te Aho, as Hilary mentioned, and I'm from the Iwi Or Nation Ngāti Mutinga, and I research and teach in the law school at the University of Auckland here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and it's my very great honour to act as the chair and discussant for this final panel session. And we have three wonderful presentations that offer Indigenous and Pacific perspectives on the way forward from four remarkable women who are each playing important roles in gender equality advocacy. So following the presentations, I'll make some remarks on the presentations as well as the more fulsome written papers that I had the pleasure of reading. There won't be time for questions, unfortunately, but one of the presenters, Jane, will be participating in the Zoom chat room during the late afternoon break, which follows the session, for anyone who wants to ask her questions directly. So the first presentation is from Betty Barkha, who's from Fiji, but currently based at Monash University. And her presentation asks whether regional commitments on gender equality are the way forward. And the second presentation is from Dorinda and Florence Drummond, two Indigenous Australian women and the co-founders of the Asia Pacific Indigenous Women's Network. And their presentation is on the use of active resistance by Indigenous Australian women to create a platform for race and gender-based rights. And the third and final presentation is from Jane Alver from the University of Canberra, whose paper is titled Negotiating Sisterhood in the Pacific Region, Feminist Alliances Across Diversity. So I hope you will enjoy the presentation.
Hello, everyone. My name is Betty Barkha, and I'm a PhD candidate at Monash University with the Center for Gender, Peace and Security. My paper today is dedicated towards exploring whether or not regional commitments on gender equality are the way forward, particularly using the example of the Pacific Platform for Action on Gender Equality. In October 2017, Pacific leaders endorsed a revised roadmap to achieving gender equality in the Pacific. The Pacific Platform for Action on Gender Equality and Women's Human Rights from 2018 to 2030, which is also known as the PPA. The PPA is an attempt to regionalize challenges and provide tangible means of implementation that can support Pacific governments in their implementation of the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action. The PPA is inclusive of commitments made to the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, the Beijing Platform for Action, Security Council Resolution 1325 on Women, Peace and Security, and the Sustainable Development Goals, to name a few. This is also to reiterate that the Pacific Platform for Action is not a standalone instrument, but rather an extension of commitments made on gender equality through international and regional commitments, such as the International Convention on Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, which is CEDAW, the Beijing Platform for Action, the Pacific Leaders Gender Equality Declaration, Samoa Pathway, and the Sustainable Development Goals, and many others. This is particularly relevant because some Pacific countries are not signatories to international frameworks. For example, Tonga and Palau have not ratified CEDAW, but have endorsed the Pacific Platform for Action. The motivation behind the Pacific Platform for Action on Gender Equality was to accelerate implementation efforts of gender commitments at all levels in order to achieve gender equality and the promotion and protection of all women and girls in all their diversity. Having personally witnessed both the review of the Beijing Platform for Action after 20 years, which is Beijing plus 20 in Bangkok, and the debates on the revised Pacific Platform for Action, there were apparent strengths and challenges to a regional agreement. Most Pacific Island countries have a Bill of Rights protected in their constitutions, ensuring basic civil and political rights. Given this rights-based foundation, the Pacific is primed to commit itself more completely to international human rights system. However, traditional and customary practices continue to limit and restrict gender inclusion in public and private spheres. Through this paper, I provide an overview and argue that regional commitments may just be the best way forward in fast-tracking implementation to commitments made under the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action. Till date, the Beijing Platform for Action remains a key blueprint for addressing gender inequality globally and requires contextual adoption regionally, nationally, and locally. I conclude the paper with a few questions that remain unanswered to researcher satisfaction, but are critical going forward. For instance, are regional commitments really the way forward, or are they just another bureaucratic process that requires government attention, which takes time and energy away from stakeholders from focusing on national implementation efforts? Or has a regional platform for action strengthened Pacific regionalism and is part of the new diplomacy that has been proposed by Pacific leaders over the last decade? Moreover, a review of the linkages between global, regional, and national frameworks and action plans are crucial for future research, making critical discourse analysis an important tool of analysis, particularly when it comes to mapping progress and learning from policy processes, while also ensuring that these processes are evidence and research informed. In my paper, I provided a brief overview of the Pacific Platform for Action and how in its current form, it seems to be strengthening Pacific regionalism and their commitment to advancing the gender agenda in upcoming years. However, whether or not regional frameworks are the way forward requires further elaboration and definitely in-depth research, which this paper is just a drop-off. Thank you.
Welcome to our presentation on the use of active resistance by Indigenous Australian women to create a platform for race and gender-based rights. We are Dorinda Cox and Florence Drummond, and we're the co-founders of the Asia Pacific Indigenous Women's Network. Our presentation comes from our lived experience as Indigenous women living and working here in Australia, but also from our subject matter expertise as attendees, presenters at the forum, UN forums in New York, South America, and across the Asia Pacific. Our research questions are about how do we create a narrative that can articulate the importance of recognising this act of resistance and respect and value and resilience and survival of Indigenous women here in Australia. Most importantly, their connection to culture and identity that's been passed on to their daughters and other women in their generation, in the next generations. And how do we create agency to elevate and find space in social and political landscapes that respect and value the critical roles of Indigenous women that have included cultural, spiritual and political influence in their families and communities for generations and continues to be part of the ever-growing concept of Indigenous feminism. This piece of work is intimately connected to the Beijing Platform for Action, but also requires an intersectional approach of gender and race equality, requires urgency, investment, and commitment and sustainability. Indigenous affairs policy currently has no gender referencing or markers for measurement, and it leads to a disjointed and inconsistent policy for Indigenous women and girls that fails to connect to the Beijing Platform for Action, particularly in the plus 25 years outcomes that should ensure that we have capability, consistency, measurement and accountability. There is an opportunity for us to decolonise this space and stop doing the circle work, which is creating a lack of direction and policy change. These consequently are and effectively seeing a lack of implementation of the global instruments of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and also the Beijing Platform for Action, which is having serious impact across our domestic policy, and particularly in our social justice area. The Black Lives Matter campaign was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for us to remodel, reconfigure and re-energise these systems. There is an urgent need for the development of an effective platform for policy and legislative change led by Indigenous Australian women, requiring urgent investments to understand, plan, implement and effectively measure the 12 areas of the Beijing Platform for Action. We must build that hybrid model for the platform across those 12 areas of Beijing, but also couple this with an economic analysis of the investment into those key areas that have impact for Indigenous women and girls to ensure accountability and transparency, both for our research and policy areas. This must act as a central and key knowledge-based portal for Australia's effective implementation and our engagement mechanism to ensure that we reach and maintain our international human rights obligations. And these approaches must include the historical, political, social, cultural, economic and religious rights of Indigenous people that have to be enshrined in Australia's constitution and legal systems, and also includes treaties with its First Peoples. We look forward to our engagement with you and in particular any questions and any dialogue that follows for this presentation. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Jane Alver. In 2015, I attended the Beijing Plus 20 review at the Commission on the Status of Women in New York as a civil society delegate. The political declaration was passed without civil society participation or debate. In 2020, the Beijing Plus 25 review, we once again saw the postponement of CSW due to COVID, but again excluding civil society voices and participation. They had a one-day high-level political forum as a replacement, but they only invited one civil society delegate and one young woman leader. Young women need to have more of a voice, and civil society needs to have more of a voice than this. The Alternative Feminist Declaration, which was drafted by civil society through the Women's Rights Caucus, was circulated in protest to amplify their disquiet. The realisation of the gains made in Beijing have been ad hoc, and there's still gaps. The UN itself acknowledged in its 25th anniversary celebration that we need to accelerate unfinished business, and this was a wake-up call, this lack of progress. It saw it as a real source of mobilisation and activism for civil society. The President of France said this is no time for commemoration and self-congratulation. In fact, it's a time for vigilance and renewed action. If there remain shortfalls in the formal institutional Beijing Declaration reviews and implementation, where can we find examples of civil society mobilising to give voice to those whose perspectives are underrepresented and marginalised? That's what this paper is about. My research into Pacific Feminist Alliance formation, such as the Pacific Feminist Forum and the We Rise Coalition, identified various areas of impact, prompting us to look broadly at what do we mean by impact. I looked at three main areas of impact. I looked at procedural impact, and we saw that agreed language from the 2017 triennial meeting of Pacific women and women's ministers was able to be included in Pacific state input to CSW in 2017, CSW 61. And this saw also a greater engagement of the Pacific duty bearers and decision makers. And it was described by one We Rise Coalition activist as keeping the Beijing platform alive for Pacific women and ensuring accountability for women's human rights. We also saw substantive impact. The triennial meeting of Pacific Women's Ministers' outcome statement in 2017 directly reflected 14 recommendations of Pacific feminists from the Pacific Feminist Charter created at the Pacific Feminist Forum in 2016. We also saw structural impact. Through active presence and coordination of Pacific feminists, there was a major breakthrough for civil society organisations at the triennial meeting in 2017, with 2 representatives of civil society to sit at the negotiating table with country heads of delegation. So despite a persistent sense that feminist civil society is merely holding the line on Beijing and turning up every 5 years for a Beijing review that really underscores a lack of progress, there is impact happening to give us heart. The formation and strengthening of diverse regional civil society and coordinated activity amplifies a feminist progressive voice. Pacific feminist civil society actors from the Pacific Feminist Forum and the We Rise Coalition shared lessons with others at the Asia Pacific Caucus for the Beijing 25 review, so that others, frustrated at the Beijing Declaration's implementation slow practice, can actually organise to have impact. Thank you.
Thank you, Betty, Dorinda, Florence and Jane for your presentations. They're all thoughtful and provocative and I think help to inspire a pathway for moving forward. So I'm going to make some comments regarding each of the 3 papers, which I understand is in a kind of conversation of sorts with each other. And if there are some core general themes of my remarks, then they relate to regionalism, potential or perceived tensions between Indigenous people's rights and human rights, and structural change in the decolonial project. So I'll start with Betty, and Betty's presentation poses the broader question of whether contextualised regional agreements are the way forward for advancing gender equality. And specifically, as she outlines, she asks whether the Pacific Platform for Action may fast-track implementation of the Beijing Platform commitments. Betty's paper doesn't seek to provide a definitive answer to either formulation of that question, although she does in her paper state that the Pacific Platform for Action might advance implementation of the Beijing commitments. Much of the discussion in Betty's paper is focused on a kind of more general assessment of progress and challenges in implementing the critical areas identified in the Beijing Declaration. And there's some really rich discussion in there. So she grapples with conceptual issues such as what gender inclusive development looks like. And she also connects aspects of her assessment to the Pacific, such as in her remarks on the climate crisis and in flawed Australian governmental responses to women's experiences of poverty in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic. I was very pleased to see an attentiveness to the structural change necessary to bring about gender equality in Betty's paper, including a move away from neoliberal development models. So I think it's an important question to ask of all of our efforts, whether they truly challenge these existing intersecting power structures, not only of patriarchy, but of wealth distribution, Eurocentrism, and so on. As is also arisen in other sessions today, Dorinda and Florence's presentation is a very powerful reminder of the necessity of intersectional approaches in the work before us. So I was really interested to hear more about from Betty about her views on where the Pacific Platform for Action might take us, and some of the types of matters that I was curious to hear about included what Betty sees as the specific attributes of the Pacific Platform for Action as a regional agreement that might render it more likely to be acted upon in the Pacific, and any evidence of this happening to date. And Jane's presentation speaks in quite a profound way to some of the positives that have come out of regional engagement amongst feminist civil society organisations on women's rights in the Pacific. I was also interested to hear more about whether the Pacific Platform for Action and regional agreements are simply a distraction from national efforts, as Betty raises, or whether they might undermine the gender equality agenda in other ways, for example, by diluting some of the commitments made internationally, or the demands made by progressive regional civil society actors. In addition, I was curious to know more about any points of tension between the Pacific Platform for Action or Pacific Women's experiences more generally and the Beijing Platform for Action or human rights more generally. So towards the close of her paper and in her presentation, Betty nods at these issues when she makes the observation that traditional and customary practices continue to limit and restrict meaningful gender inclusion in private and public realms. And this, of course, is a very complex and sensitive ongoing issue, which has been referenced already today. And it did make me think of debates ongoing within my own Pacific nation, Aotearoa New Zealand, and Māori culture. And some scholars here, such as Ani Makaere, have argued that Māori culture was traditionally very gender balanced, and it was the introduction of Western colonial values and Christianity that brought us out of balance. So, of course, we must always critically interrogate those claims, but I think this is an area where the decolonial project that Dorinda and Florence work on takes on a special importance. For it's not necessarily always the customary practices themselves that conflict with gender equality. It can be the colonial influenced or informed manifestations of those expressions. So, in fact, in the New Zealand context, Ani Makaere argues that a return to customary practice unfettered by colonialism, if we could achieve that, would restore gender balance. So she sees Indigenous law and custom as a solution, not the issue. And I raise this conscious of the very different realities and experiences across the Pacific and of differing perspectives on this by Indigenous women, but as just as a topic for reflection. So in sum, I think Betty's paper raises some really important questions on a necessary topic, and I welcome her developing insights and reflections. Dorinda and Florence's powerful presentation and paper contribute to a growing Indigenous or Black women's feminism, which has at its heart decolonisation, Indigenous self-determination, and Indigenous women and girls' enjoyment of their Indigenous people's rights and human rights. And they're concerned with valuing Indigenous women's resistance and creating respectful spaces for the critical voices of Indigenous women to be heard. And they call for an intersectional approach to Indigenous affairs law and policy, which is attentive to gender and race, which is led by Indigenous Australian women in order to bring about change in line with the areas of the Beijing Platform for Action and the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which is the primary global statement on Indigenous people's rights. And one point that I was thinking of as I read the paper is this idea of understanding Indigenous peoples as ethnic groups or races. And I should preface this by saying that in my own work, for example, in considering the application of non-discrimination law to Māori, I effectively treat Māori as an ethnic group. But some very esteemed scholars contest the categorisation of Indigenous people as racial or ethnic groups, preferring to view them as political groupings. So it got me thinking what flow-on effects a shift to really centering the political nature of Indigenous collectives might have when, for example, we take these intersectional approaches. So understanding Indigenous peoples as a political grouping means that Indigenous peoples' nationhood and right to self-determination comes front and centre, and it helps to kind of hammer home the structural reordering of the state that's required. Now, Dorinda and Florence are firm in stating that decolonisation requires fostering and respecting Indigenous self-determination, and they're also clear that approaches to gender equality must respect Indigenous people's rights. And that both must be reflected in the law and constitution and in treaty making with Indigenous peoples. So that conceptual shift might just buttress what they're already saying. Now, Indigenous people's rights, including as affirmed in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, include affirmations regarding the maintenance of and respect for Indigenous people's own cultural and legal institutions in accordance with international human rights standards. And Dorinda and Florence's comments on Indigenous people's rights and the importance of the cultural resistance and resilience of Indigenous women suggests that they may see Indigenous Australian customary law and practice as playing a significant role in advancing gender equality for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island women, even if those spaces also need to be decolonised. So in this sense, they may help to contribute to debate on the customary practice tension that's raised in Betty's paper. So I think Dorinda and Florence's call to action is timely and critical. Jane's excellent paper responds to this sense that at the global level, women's rights are in a state of inertia or backsliding, and that feminist advocacy is failing to have impact. And she responds to this by presenting very welcome examples of feminist Pacific regional alliances having impact at both the regional and global levels. And her presentation and paper takes an expansive understanding of impact to include procedural, substantive and structural impact. Jane highlights some of the impacts in each of those categories in her presentation, so I won't labour those, even though they are vital and thrilling. Instead, I wanted to focus my comments on her categorisation and ways of understanding impact. So impact is notoriously difficult to assess with any rigour, and often impact analyses can be quite unsophisticated, and some of my own work, I think, would fall into that category. So I was very impressed at Jane's considered and scholarly approach to the issue and her commitment to capture something of the diversity of impact. As Jane points out, much research is focused upon the policy impact of social movements, for example, is reflected in legislative change, because those are the impacts that are far easier to measure, more so than the kind of more diffuse social and cultural changes that we might be looking for. So what Jane's paper does that's really exciting and productive is extend the common understandings of the sites where impact occurs. So she focuses in particular on ways of understanding social movement impacts that go beyond policy change. And in doing so, Jane draws on the work of Herbert Kitschelt, who identified the three spheres of impact that she uses: procedural, substantive and structural, and who himself drew on William Ganson's The Strategy of Protest. But I think in the gloss that she gives these spheres, Jane's paper makes a really wonderful contribution to the literature on the impact of social movements, in addition to her insights for scholarship on women's rights and Pacific feminist civil society actors specifically. The work of the Pacific feminist civil society actors that she considers, I think, has the potential to be a really powerful model for others. And the impacts she identifies, I think, as I mentioned, will be of assistance in considering questions connected to those that Betty raises on the role of regional commitments and alliances. We can question whether the more incremental positive impacts Jane identifies will bring about the fundamental structural change that an intersectional decolonial approach demands. But in her paper, Jane argues that these small-scale changes are important sites of feminist innovation and also of alliance building with considerable impact. And we can say at the very least that they're an important step on the path in the right direction. So I think Jane's demonstration of the strengthening of regional feminist progressive voices is compelling and affirming. So just to quickly conclude, if we take inspiration from these strong Indigenous and Pacific women on the way forward for women's rights, we see that it might be found in regional alliances and work, and that it certainly must be contextual, intersectional, decolonial, progressive and structurally transforming. So thank you all very much for listening, and just a reminder that Jane will be participating in the Zoom chat room following the session for anyone who wants to ask her questions directly. Kia ora koutou.
Well, thank you so much, Fleur, and for the three wonderful papers that were presented in that stream. They were so rich and give us so much hope, I think, of thinking about new ways of organising, going back to the local and the regional to really think through new strategies for engaging on women's rights, adding that decolonialist element to it, which I think is so vital in any way forward for women's rights. And it's wonderful that we are raising that issue here today, but it's obviously an area that we all need to think more about and to learn from those who are really working at the coalface on these issues. So thank you to you, Fleur, really insightful comments, and to the panellists, as I've mentioned. My only disappointment is we didn't get to see your baby, Fleur, but we know that there are a few babies around our community today, and it's been just gorgeous to, well, hear voices from the next generation, but seeing evidence of the generation to come again. So congratulations to you on your baby, and a call out to Emma Palmer, to June, who I think we've thought has won the internet today for her gorgeous photo, and anyone else out there doing the juggle with the baby on the knee while they listen and talk today.